the border of two countries that used to be one of the most famous honeymoon destinations on Earth. Presidents visited it, movie stars posed in front of it. For over a century, saying you'd been to the falls meant something. And yet today, on one side of that same river, there's a city with boarded-up houses, empty storefronts, and a population that's shrunk by more than half. So today, we're going inside the downfall of Niagara Falls and asking, why is nobody coming back? The falls that started it all. Niagara Falls has been drawing awestruck visitors since long before anyone thought to build a gift shop nearby. The falls themselves, formed by glacial activity roughly 12,000 years ago, straddle the border between Ontario, Canada, and New York State, split into three distinct sections: Horseshoe Falls, American Falls, and the smaller Bridal Veil Falls. Indigenous nations in the region had long understood the site's power and significance well before European settlers arrived, and the name itself is believed to derive from an Iroquoian word for the area. The honeymoon tradition that would come to define Niagara Falls for the better part of 2 centuries traces back to 1801, when Theodosia Burr, daughter of sitting Vice President Aaron Burr, traveled there with her new husband Joseph Alston on what was, at the time, an unusually adventurous bridal tour. A few years later, Jerome Bonaparte, younger brother of Napoleon, made his own celebrated trip to the falls with his American bride, traveling all the way from New Orleans by stagecoach. Word of these fashionable trips spread through high society, and by the mid-1800s, Niagara Falls had firmly cemented its reputation as the honeymoon capital of the world, a title local boosters would keep marketing for the next 150 years, right down to the image printed on boxes of shredded wheat cereal. By the 20th century, the falls had become one of the most obligatory stops on any respectable American vacation itinerary, visited by presidents, foreign dignitaries, and, in 1953, immortalized on the silver screen when Marilyn Monroe starred in the film simply titled Niagara. For a long stretch of American history, this was about as close to a can't-miss destination as the country had. Other honeymooners along the way added their own layer of significance to the tradition. Frederick Douglass, the famed abolitionist and orator, traveled to Niagara Falls with his second wife, Helen Pitts Douglas, in a marriage that was considered controversial at the time, given that Douglas was black and Pitts was white. Their trip to a place already associated with romance and freedom carried its own symbolic weight, particularly given the falls' proximity to the Canadian border, which had long served as a crossing point for enslaved people fleeing north via the Underground Railroad, with figures like Harriet Tubman guiding some of them through the region personally. By the Victorian era, the falls had become such a fixture of American cultural life that visiting authors, including Fanny Trollope, mother of novelist Anthony Trollope, wrote extensively about the vertiginous thrill of climbing down to view the rapids up close, turning water into power. What makes Niagara Falls more than just a scenic backdrop is the sheer volume of water thundering over it. And it didn't take long for industrialists to notice the opportunity sitting right there. As early as 1881, entrepreneurs began tapping the falls to generate electricity, and by 1894, 7 separate companies were already harnessing the river's power. The formation of the Niagara Falls Power Company in 1878 effectively locked in the city's industrial future, and by the early 1900s, the abundance of cheap hydroelectric power had turned Niagara Falls, New York, into a magnet for heavy manufacturing and chemical production. Companies like Hooker Chemical and Nabisco set up shop, drawn by electricity prices that manufacturers elsewhere in the country simply couldn't match. For decades, this actually worked. Immigrants arrived looking for steady factory jobs, neighborhoods filled in around Main Street, and the city built a genuinely diverse economy that didn't depend entirely on tourists snapping photos of the falls. Niagara Falls, in other words, wasn't just a pretty backdrop. It was a working industrial city with a world-famous waterfall attached to it. By the 1950s, Niagara Falls, New York, had grown into a mid-sized industrial city of well over 100,000 residents, with a downtown dense enough to support department stores, movie theaters, and a genuinely busy Main Street that had little to do with tourism at all. Locals at the time would have had every reason to assume the city's manufacturing base, backed by some of the cheapest electricity in the country, was a permanent fixture rather than a temporary boom. Few, if any, could have predicted that within a single generation, both the factories and a huge share of the population that worked in them would simply be gone. That combination held up reasonably well until the middle of the 20th century, when two things happened almost simultaneously. American manufacturing broadly began shifting overseas and to cheaper regions domestically, and one particular chemical company's decades-old waste disposal practices came back to haunt the entire city in a way nobody saw coming. It's worth noting that the push to fully harness the falls for power was never without controversy. Between roughly 1906 and 1911, conservationists squared off against developers and industrialists over just how much of the river's flow should be diverted toward hydroelectric generation, with President Theodore Roosevelt himself eventually weighing in on the side of preserving the falls rather than letting industry drain it dry. That tension between the falls as a natural spectacle worth protecting and the falls as a resource worth exploiting for cheap electricity never fully went away. It just shifted focus, from arguments over water diversion in the early 1900s to arguments over industrial waste disposal by the middle of the century. The toxic legacy beneath the neighborhood. Between 1942 and 1953, Hooker Chemical Company used a partially dug, abandoned canal a few miles from the falls as a dumping ground for industrial waste, eventually burying somewhere around 21,000 tons of chemicals there, including several known carcinogens. Once the canal was full, Hooker capped it with clay, sold the land to the local school board for $1, and included a legal disclaimer in the deed attempting to absolve itself of future responsibility. An elementary school was built directly on top of it by 1955, and new homes went up around the site shortly after. For years, the neighborhood functioned normally, aside from occasional and unexplained health complaints. Then, in the late 1970s, a string of unusually wet winters raised the local water table, and the buried chemicals began leaching upward into basements, yards, and eventually the school's own playground. Investigative journalism and door-to-door health surveys organized by residents, most famously led by a local mother named Lois Gibbs, began surfacing a disturbing pattern of miscarriages, birth defects, and chromosomal damage among people living closest to the canal. In August of 1978, New York's health commissioner closed the elementary school and ordered the evacuation of roughly 240 families living within 2 blocks of the site. That wasn't the end of it. Following an EPA health study in 1980, President Jimmy Carter ordered a full evacuation of the remaining community, ultimately relocating hundreds more families using federal disaster funds. Love Canal became the textbook case that led directly to the creation of the federal Superfund program, and decades of lawsuits eventually forced Hooker's parent company, Occidental Petroleum, to pay well over $200 million combined to the state and federal government. The human toll behind those numbers is worth sitting with for a moment. Lois Gibbs, the mother who first organized her neighbors after reading a newspaper story about the buried chemicals near her own home, later described discovering that 20,000 tons of extremely toxic waste sat buried just 3 blocks from where her children played. Residents testified to chromosome damage, elevated rates of miscarriage, and clusters of birth defects that seemed to concentrate specifically around homes closest to the old canal. Internal Hooker chemical documents that surfaced years later, including a 1958 memo describing children who had suffered chemical burns from exposed waste at the site, suggested the company had been aware of hazards at Love Canal for roughly 2 decades before the crisis became public. For a city that had spent a century marketing itself as a romantic natural wonder, having its name permanently attached to one of the worst environmental disasters in American history was, to put it mildly, not a great look. Parts of the old Love Canal neighborhood were eventually declared safe again in the early 1990s and quietly renamed Black Creek Village, with the state auctioning off remediated homes to new buyers. But the damage to the city's reputation and to public trust in its own leadership had already been done, and it lingered for decades after the last toxic barrel had technically been cleaned up. Urban renewal's broken promises. As industrial jobs dried up through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, city and state officials scrambled for a fix, and the fix they landed on was urban renewal. Tear down large sections of the existing city and replace them with something new. In practice, this meant demolishing hundreds of buildings, entire blocks, and long-standing neighborhoods along and around Main Street, on the promise that fresh development and increased tourism would follow. Much of that promised development never actually materialized. Vacant lots simply replaced the buildings that used to occupy them. And the city's population, which had peaked at over 100,000 around 1960, was cut roughly in half within a generation. Compounding the damage, the state built the Robert Moses Parkway in the early 1960s, a 4-lane highway that ran directly along the Niagara Gorge, physically cutting the city and its downtown off from its own waterfront. Rather than drawing visitors deeper into Main Street, the parkway funneled cars straight past it toward the state park and back out again. It took the state decades to admit the mistake. In 2016, then-Governor Andrew Cuomo called the Robert Moses Parkway a mistake outright, telling reporters that you don't block off your own greatest asset. Removal of a 2-mile stretch of the parkway finally began in earnest in 2018, part of a roughly $42 million project to restore around 140 acres of green space and reconnect downtown Niagara Falls to the gorge it had been walled off from for more than 50 years. The work wrapped up in late 2020, and the road was formally renamed the Niagara Scenic Parkway. The scale of what urban renewal actually destroyed is easy to understate. Entire blocks that once housed generations of immigrant families who'd arrived specifically to work the hydroelectric and chemical plants were leveled on the promise of replacement development that, for the most part, simply never arrived. Churches, civic organizations, and small family-run businesses that had anchored those neighborhoods for decades closed permanently once the surrounding population disappeared. What was left, by most accounts, was a downtown with more open lots than actual buildings, a condition that persisted largely unaddressed for the better part of half a century before anyone in a position of real authority was willing to call the original plan a failure out loud. A tale of two cities. Here's where the comparison becomes almost impossible to avoid. The exact same waterfall, viewed from two different countries, tells two completely different economic stories. While Niagara Falls, New York, spent the back half of the 20th century leaning on manufacturing and then losing that bet entirely, Niagara Falls, Ontario, just across the river, committed early and consistently to tourism and kept building on it. The Canadian side built hotels, restaurants, observation towers, and attractions at a scale the American side never matched, all while enjoying what's generally considered the more photogenic angle on the falls themselves, since Horseshoe Falls, the larger and more dramatic of the two main cataracts, sits mostly on the Canadian side of the border. By 2019, Niagara Falls, Ontario, was pulling in roughly 12.3 million visitors a year, compared to about 9.6 million at Niagara Falls State Park on the American side, and Canadian visitor spending in the region, at roughly 2.4 billion Canadian dollars that year, comfortably outpaced the 731 million US dollars spent in Niagara County, New York. That gap has held remarkably steady across multiple years of tourism data, suggesting it's less a temporary fluctuation and more a structural difference in how the two cities have chosen to invest in themselves over the last half-century. It's not that the American side gets no visitors. Niagara Falls State Park, America's oldest state park, still draws millions of people every year specifically to see the falls. The problem, according to residents and multiple local reporters who've covered the city extensively, is what happens after visitors leave the park boundary. One recent piece from the Niagara Falls Reporter put it about as plainly as you can. Tourists barely unpack their bags before leaving the city entirely, heading either deeper into the state or straight across the border, because there's comparatively little reason to stick around downtown once they've seen the water. The contrast becomes even starker when you consider poverty and unemployment figures rather than just visitor counts. Niagara Falls, New York, has frequently posted the highest unemployment rate in the entire state of New York, and roughly 1 in 5 residents lives below the poverty line, with a similar share of housing lots sitting vacant or in visible disrepair. The FBI has also flagged the city as having one of the higher crime rates in the state relative to its population. None of that is true of Niagara Falls, Ontario, which has spent decades building out a genuinely diversified tourism economy, complete with casinos, a wine region nearby in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and a steady flow of hotel and restaurant investment that simply hasn't had an equivalent on the American side of the gorge. The casino gamble. By the early 2000s, with manufacturing gone and tourism underperforming relative to its Canadian neighbor, city and state leaders turned to a familiar last resort: gambling. The Seneca Nation opened the Seneca Niagara Casino in the city in 2002, eventually drawing an estimated 7 million visitors a year on its own. On paper, that sounds like exactly the kind of anchor tenant a struggling downtown needs. In practice, the casino has functioned largely as its own self-contained island, with relatively little of that foot traffic spilling out into the surrounding neighborhood or benefiting nearby small businesses. Worse, a prolonged legal dispute between the Seneca Nation and New York State over gaming compact terms led the tribe to withhold its required revenue-sharing payments to the city for years, at one point leaving Niagara Falls owed more than $60 million it had already budgeted around. For a municipal government already stretched thin, losing tens of millions of dollars in anticipated casino revenue mid-decade wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a genuine fiscal emergency. Faced with a shrinking population, a battered reputation, and a stalled casino relationship, the city's leadership over the following years basically threw everything at the wall. Officials legalized gay marriage ceremonies at the falls to attract a new wave of destination weddings, allowed a legal tightrope walk across the gorge that would previously have resulted in arrest, and even floated, briefly and unsuccessfully, the idea of accepting wastewater from hydraulic fracturing operations elsewhere in the state. One mayor, Paul Dister, summarized the strategy with a phrase that says a lot about where the city found itself. If you piece together a series of wins, then I think it becomes transformative. Around the same period, city planners floated an entirely different pitch aimed at a much younger demographic, paying down student loan debt for college graduates willing to relocate and put down roots in Niagara Falls. The logic made a certain kind of sense on paper. A city with cheap housing stock and a genuinely spectacular natural landmark ought to be able to attract young professionals if the financial math worked out favorably enough. Whether that particular incentive program moved the needle in any measurable way is harder to say, but its existence alone tells you something about how far outside conventional economic development playbooks the city had been forced to wander just to keep trying something, anything, that might stick. Trying everything, getting some of it. To be fair to the city, not every attempt at reinvention has failed outright. The removal of the Robert Moses Parkway genuinely did open up new green space and reconnect downtown to the water for the first time in half a century. A private developer, Blue Cardinal Capital, purchased dozens of parcels along Main Street specifically because the parkway's removal made the area viable for redevelopment again, converting some long vacant buildings into boutique hotels, retail space, and apartments with the help of state revitalization grants. Recent tourism spending figures even show some genuine progress. In 2023, visitor spending in Niagara County reached roughly $1.08 billion, an increase of nearly 12% over the previous year, and, according to local tourism officials, the highest figure ever recorded for the American side. That's a real number, and it suggests the state park and its surrounding attractions still have plenty of pull on their own merits. But progress on paper hasn't fully translated into progress on the ground. City reporters covering Niagara Falls as recently as late 2025 describe a downtown where vacant storefronts still outnumber occupied ones along stretches of Main Street and Pine Avenue, where potholes have been compared to trenches, and where the city's population, now hovering around 47 to 49,000 people, continues drifting downward rather than stabilizing. One recent piece bluntly described the city as being on the brink of collapse, pointing to a shrinking tax base and growing strain on the residents who remain. Some observers have pointed toward the city's massive hydroelectric infrastructure, still among the largest in the country, as an underused asset that could theoretically anchor a very different kind of economic future, one built around energy-hungry industries like data centers, battery storage manufacturing, or advanced computing rather than tourism dollars alone. Whether Niagara Falls can actually pivot in that direction after decades of failed reinvention attempts remains an open question, and residents who've watched previous transformative plans come and go over the last several decades can be forgiven for a certain amount of skepticism toward the next one. The new border problem. Just as Niagara Falls seemed to be clawing back some momentum, an entirely new and largely unrelated obstacle emerged. And this one had nothing to do with chemical spills or highway placement. Starting in 2025, cross-border travel between the United States and Canada dropped sharply, driven primarily by a period of significant political and economic tension between the two countries, including new American tariffs on Canadian goods and public remarks from the American administration suggesting Canada could become the 51st U.S. state. Those comments and policies were widely reported as prompting a noticeable, organized pullback in Canadian travel to the United States, sometimes described in Canadian media as an informal travel boycott. The numbers back up the shift. According to Statistics Canada, road trips by Canadians into the United States fell by 38% in May of 2025 compared to the same month the previous year, marking the fifth consecutive month of year-over-year declines at the time. By early 2026, broader analysis showed Canadian resident return trips to the U.S. down more than 25% for the year, with air travel from Canada dropping as well. Since Canadian visitors have traditionally made up roughly a quarter of all foreign travelers entering the United States, and since Niagara Falls sits directly on one of the busiest and most symbolically important crossings on the entire northern border, the region felt this shift almost immediately. Local tourism officials reported real, measurable consequences. The Niagara Falls USA Visitor Center recorded a 27% drop in visits, and a survey by the North Country Chamber of Commerce found that 83% of local businesses reported fewer Canadian customers, with a majority of those businesses directly attributing the decline to the political climate between the two countries. International spending at Niagara Falls State Park itself fell by roughly 4.7%, a number local officials called significant. Even the Canadian side, which had always relied heavily on American visitors crossing the other direction, wasn't spared. Niagara Parks Commission officials in Ontario reported a 9% drop in revenue from American travelers over the same period, even as an increase in visitors from other countries helped soften the overall blow on that side of the river. One visitor interviewed at the falls during this stretch, when asked why he'd still made the trip despite everything, put it simply, "I like America." Another, visiting from India, said the United States had always been on his bucket list regardless of the headlines. Tourism officials on both sides of the border have expressed cautious optimism that the downturn is temporary, pointing out, correctly, that travel demand tends to be resilient over the long run, even through periods of political friction. Whether that optimism holds is, as of this recording, still very much an open question. The financial stakes involved are larger than a single border town's economy. Canadian tourism to the United States as a whole contributed an estimated $20.5 billion to the American economy in 2024 alone, supporting roughly 140,000 jobs, concentrated heavily in exactly the kind of border communities Niagara Falls represents. When that spending pulls back even modestly on a percentage basis, the dollar impact compounds quickly across hotels, restaurants, retail shops, and the seasonal tourism jobs that so many border region economies depend on to get through the winter. Interestingly, one specific crossing point in the Niagara region actually bucked the broader downward trend at points during this period, with pedestrian crossings occasionally spiking even as overall vehicle traffic fell. A reminder that even during a well-documented downturn, the numbers on the ground don't always move in perfect lockstep with the national headlines. So why isn't anybody coming back? Put all of this together, and Niagara Falls starts to look less like a single story of decline and more like several separate declines that happen to land on the same city at almost the same time. A century of honeymoon tourism gave way to a manufacturing boom that seemed, for a while, like a smarter long-term bet. That manufacturing boom collapsed, taking half the city's population with it. Right around the same time, one of its biggest chemical employers left behind a buried, leaking legacy that made national headlines for all the wrong reasons. The state's own attempt to fix the resulting economic mess, tearing down neighborhoods and building a highway straight through the waterfront, made the actual problem measurably worse for another 50 years. And just as the city started genuinely correcting some of those mistakes, removing the parkway, redeveloping Main Street, posting real increases in tourism spending, an entirely separate, entirely unrelated political dispute between two allied countries cut directly into the one remaining source of foot traffic the city could still reliably count on. What makes the Niagara Falls story different from a lot of other declining American cities is just how little of it can be pinned on any single decision, scandal, or villain. Detroit had the auto industry's collapse. Atlantic City had casino overexpansion and out-of-state competition. Niagara Falls has almost the opposite problem. A long, tangled chain of separate mistakes and misfortunes, most of them made decades apart by different people with different intentions, that all happened to compound on top of one another in the same 20-square-mile patch of upstate New York. Remove any single link in that chain. The Love Canal disaster, the Robert Moses Parkway, the casino revenue dispute, and the city's story probably looks meaningfully different today. Instead, all of it happened, more or less in sequence, to the same place. None of this means Niagara Falls is finished. The waterfall itself isn't going anywhere. And neither is the roughly 9.5 million people who still show up on the American side every year specifically to see it. But a city needs more than a spectacular backdrop to actually thrive. And Niagara Falls, New York, has spent the better part of 70 years discovering, the hard way, everything a place needs besides scenery. Millions of people are still coming to look at the falls. Whether they're staying, spending, or coming back a second time is a considerably harder question. And right now, for reasons that have piled up over generations and multiplied again just in the last couple of years, the answer keeps landing on no. There's a particular kind of irony sitting underneath all of this that's hard to ignore. The falls themselves haven't changed in any meaningful way in the 2 centuries since Theodosia Burr first made the trip up from Albany. The water still thunders over the same rock ledge, mist still rises hundreds of feet into the air, and the view still stops people in their tracks the same way it always has. What changed was everything built around it. The industries that came and went, the neighborhoods that rose and were bulldozed, the casino money that arrived and then got tied up in a legal fight for years. And now, the political weather between 2 countries that share the same river. The falls were never really the problem. Everything humans decided to build, dump, tear down, and argue about next to them was. If you enjoyed this look at what happened to one of America's most famous natural wonders, give this video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the place's history built up and then quietly let fall apart.